Welcome everyone to our science-based target webinar. Olivia's done a great job of introducing me, but I'm Laura. As she mentioned, I manage our climate course, Climate for SMEs, 4 Steps to Action, and kind of work on all things net zero and environment at heart of the city. So we have a really topical session today covering science-based targets, as I've just seen through looking on LinkedIn and the media and everything like that, that they are becoming more mainstream now and people are talking about them a lot more. So hopefully this session will help you really understand what they are and why people are finding them important and talking about them more. I will be covering science-based targets in general, and then also honing in specifically on the SME route as well to make that relevant to our SME community. So on the next slide, please, Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to be setting the net zero scene, which is really most important to understanding what net zero is, as it's a fundamental part of science-based targets. So it is quite hard to fully understand what science-based targets are without knowing a few of the key terms. I'm going to be going over 7 key terms quite briefly so that you understand them. I do know and I recognise some names on the attendee list that quite a few are from our network and climate course and events I've spoken at before, so you will be familiar with me talking about these terms. So it will just be a recap of them for you, but there are others on the call who are likely to be new to the net zero and science-based target space, so it's really important to cover those terms so that everyone understands them. So on the next slide, I'm going to kick off with the scope. So most of you would have seen this image quite a few times before. And what it does is it breaks down a business's carbon footprint into 3 different categories, and the categories are called scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1 are direct emissions that you own as a business, and they are things like company vehicles that you own and gas that's on your site. And scope 2 are indirect emissions that you own, and really all that falls into that is your electricity. So they are emissions that you own, and they're quite, in terms of what you need to measure, they're quite a small amount of what you measure, whereas scope 3, which are the 2 purple arrows with lots of images in them, are indirect emissions that you don't own, and they are everything else that you need to run your business and for it to operate as it does, that aren't in your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it's things like the purchase services and goods, so everything you buy for your business to be able to operate, your employees commute in so that they can get your product and service ready to sell, the waste that you produce, for example. Yeah, they're 3 examples of your scope 3 emissions. So yeah, scope 1 and 2 and 3 are the different categories of what makes up your carbon footprint as a business. And on the next slide, I'm covering what carbon neutral and net zero means. Hopefully this will be a recap for most of you, but we're focusing on net zero today. That's quite a chunky part of science-based targets. It's really important to fully understand what it means. And I always put carbon neutral along with it, because I see people talking about using carbon neutral and net zero and using them as if they mean the same thing, whereas actually they mean very different things. So carbon neutral is when you measure your carbon footprint and there's no imposed scope really of what you have to measure. So from the images you just saw on the last slide, you can pick and choose what you want to measure, and you get a total and call that your carbon footprint. You then balance those emissions to 0. So you buy the equivalent amount in offsets, and that's how you balance them out. And you then become carbon neutral. And there are 2 types of offsets, and you can use both of them for carbon neutral status. Whereas net zero is where you have to measure all of your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions. So they're the emissions that you own as a business, and your material scope 3 emissions. So anything which is integral for you running as a business. The most important differentiation is that you have to reduce your emissions in net zero, and you have to reduce them to the absolute minimum possible. And then anything that's left after that, you can offset using removal offsets only. And the science-based target do give a kind of percentage indication that for net zero, you reduce your emissions by around 90 to 95% from your baseline year. So your unavoidable emissions are normally around 5 to 10% of your baseline year emissions. So carbon neutral and net zero are very different things. And we normally say, well, it is that carbon neutral is a stepping stone to net zero. It is a good place to get to when you're using it as a transition phase, but not as an endpoint itself. And then lastly, my last two key terms are on offsetting. So I've mentioned there are two types of offsetting, avoidance and removal offsets. Thank you. And I'll be going through the difference between them. So avoidance offsets are where you pay into projects that they themselves don't remove carbon from the atmosphere, but they're mitigating more carbon entering the atmosphere. So there's examples of renewable energy infrastructure. Cook stove projects is a common one that we see as well. So sorry if you've heard this before, because my staple example is always solar panel farms. I find that's something that most people know what they are. So that's a good example to use. But solar panels themselves don't remove carbon from the atmosphere, but they do increase the amount of renewable energy available and therefore reduce the reliance on fossil fuels and therefore reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So that's an example of an avoidance offset. Whereas a removal offset kind of does what it says on the tin. They are projects that you pay into where carbon is directly removed from the atmosphere as a result of the offset. So the first bullet point is tree planting. That is a really common offset project, and that is classified as a removal offset. However, I always like to highlight that they're not permanent removals. So trees do have a natural kind of lifespan. It is a very long one, but they eventually do kind of die. So they are not sources of permanent carbon removal. Whereas the 3 bullet points listed below are examples of permanent carbon removal. And that's why, so yeah, both of those can be used for carbon neutral, and removal offsets are used for net zero, and they're the only offsets you can use for net zero. So net zero is where overall you're operating as a business and you're trying to, at the end of the year, have no impact on the environment. So you're reducing your emissions to the minimum possible, but anything that is unavoidable, you have to remove back from the atmosphere to reach that net level. So that is a really quick overview of the key terms, which I know if that is the first time you're hearing it, can be a bit like someone's just thrown a pile of words at you, but I'll come on to the support Heart of the City has at the end, but we do have guidance of what all these terms mean written down so that you can refer back to them if you ever want to. So if we go on to the next slide, we're moving on now to science-based targets, which is the meat of this session. So on the next slide, we're going to discuss what they actually are. So really simply, a science-based target is something that tells you how fast, so it gives you a time scale, and how much, and it gives you a percentage of carbon in the atmosphere, of how much that carbon needs to reduce to keep Earth a habitable place for humans to live on. So they were formed around the same time as the Paris Agreement, which was formed in 2015. And the Paris Agreement is an international agreement where governments committed to limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, with efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. They're kind of the two main numbers that we're working with, 2 and 1.5 degrees. And in 2015, we were told those are the maximum temperatures that global warming can reach before there will be kind of absolutely catastrophic impacts of climate change on the Earth, worse than what we're seeing now, of kind of the variety of floods we're seeing in many different countries, and when the summers will become hotter and drier, the winters will become warmer and wetter, and the Earth will just become kind of an uninhabitable place for humans. Moving on slightly, a few years later, sorry, previous slide, I'm moving on in my timeline. In 2018, the IPCC, which stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, really indicated that 1.5 degrees is actually the maximum. 2 degrees is too warm, and we have to be aiming for that 1.5 degrees, which is why you'll be hearing 1.5 a lot through this presentation. And when anyone talks about science-based targets, that 1.5 degrees is kind of that magic number. So when a business or anyone is setting a science-based target, and that's a science-based net zero target, really. It means that you're aligning your reduction pathway with the latest climate science and what it says to be able to keep emissions at a level where global warming won't reach above 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. So keeping us at a place where humans can still live on the earth and continue as we are now. But the targets that are given for science-based climate targets are very large scale, and it's for the earth. So the earth has to not reach above 1.5 degrees, and it's really hard to understand what does that mean. You know, keeping it relevant to this webinar, what does that mean? Kind of an SME sat in England, it is quite hard to make that relatable. And that is where the Science-Based Target Initiative comes in. So the SBTI for short is a partnership between 4 organisations: the CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, the UN Global Compact, WRI, which stands for the World Resource Institute, and WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So they've come together as a group to form the SBTI, and that's exactly kind of what that group does. It gives best practice, standard and guidelines on what businesses can do to align with the latest climate science to keep Earth at that only warming to a 1.5 degree level. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll look at why you should be working towards science-based targets. So apart from the environmental reasons, so keeping warming below that level, which means Earth is a nicer place for humans to live on and a habitable place for humans, there are a raft of reasons as to why you should be kind of keeping in line with science-based targets and using the Science-Based Target Initiative. So there's a list of benefits on the screen, and the first one is boosting your competitive advantage. So currently, well, when I checked last week on the 14th of February, there were 165 UK SMEs that had set a validated science-based target. So the names are published on the Science-Based Target Initiative's website for who they validated. And yeah, there were 165 UK SMEs. In comparison to the over 5 million SMEs that are in the UK, that is a really, really small percentage of them that have submitted a validated target. And also, to put that into context a little bit, of the 165, in January, Heart of the City actually helped around 20% of them set a science-based target through a programme we run with Grosvenor to help the SMEs and their supply chain set a target. So you can see that that's quite a recent jump in the numbers. So you will still be ahead of the curve and kind of use and have it as a unique selling point if you do submit a science-based target. To put that into a bit of context, a lot of large businesses are asking, or they do have a lot of targets internally for environmental metrics. So they've been looking at their kind of scope 1 and 2 first, where they're looking at their own internal emissions that they own, kind of getting their own house in order. And now they're really focusing on their scope 3 emissions. So looking at where they can influence. And a large part of that for a lot of businesses is looking at their supply chain, because that's something where they can have quite a bit of influence. As a result, there's more and more large businesses coming out with targets for their supply chains, having science-based targets. So an example, I mentioned Grosvenor. So Grosvenor have stopped awarding contracts over £1 million to suppliers without science-based targets. EY and Network Rail, they've set a target for 75% of their suppliers to have a science-based target by 2025. Schroders have done the same. They want 70% of their suppliers to have a science-based target in the near future. Salesforce, they have a target for 60% of their suppliers to have a science-based target by 2025, and kind of the list goes on. So we're seeing more and more large businesses following suit with setting metrics for their supply chain to be able to measure their environmental kind of credentials and what they're doing to reduce their emissions as well. So if you are an SME and kind of a tier 1 supplier of those large businesses, it's a real competitive advantage you can have, and you're staying relevant to your customers by being able to have a science-based target. But also it is trickling down the supply chain. So you may not be a tier 1 supplier of those businesses with those targets, but you're likely to be a tier 2, tier 3, or further down the supply chain. So that will eventually kind of trickle through all the tiers and cover a large range of businesses, which often do encompass quite a lot of SMEs. And there's a range of other business benefits as well. It can help you future-proof your business, because through setting a science-based target, you need to identify ways in which you can reduce your emissions, and you're looking at ways then that you can future-proof, whether that's financially, whether that's making sure your resources can withstand results of climate change and things like that. So it can help you become more resilient as well. And it can help you understand and mitigate any climate risks which may be detrimental to your business. As I mentioned, they can all be picked up in your reduction plan. There are a range of business benefits. If we go on to the next slide, we're now going to get into the meaty details of the Science-Based Target Initiative and of the application process, and giving you lots of details around that. I do want to caveat that you can still submit a science-based net zero target without submitting through the Science-Based Target Initiative. It just means that your science-based net zero target won't be validated by them and you won't have your name on their website, but that doesn't mean that it won't be in line with the latest climate science. You can still take their best practice and their guidance and their information on what you need to do, but not directly submit through them. But what I'm going to cover now is how you submit through the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is how you get it validated. There are a few different avenues to setting a science-based target through the SBTI. They have a large business route and a small business route. So the small business route is they define a small business as a non-subsidiary independent company with less than 500 employees. And essentially, if you're not in that category, you're a large business. There's two different routes there. The only difference is they do have a separate financial institution route. And that's for all businesses, whether you're small or large. So they're kind of standard financial institutions that you'll know and recognise. So businesses like banks, investors, insurance companies, pension funds, anything to do with pensions. But they also do classify a financial institution as a business where at least 5% of their revenue comes from activities that I've just mentioned. So activities that relate to a financial institution. So if 5% of your revenue comes from investments, you would be classified as a financial institution under the SBTI. And there is also currently a few institutions and organisations that can't currently set a science-based target through the SBTI. They are looking to expand that soon and encompass all organisations, but currently, and it is listed on the screen, cities, local governments, public sector institutions, educational institutions, not-for-profit organisations, and oil and gas organisations cannot set a science-based target through the SBTI. And again, something to note, same as the financial institutions kind of route, is that for the oil and gas, is that companies with more than 5% of revenue from a fossil fuel asset, whether that's dormant or active, will be considered an oil and gas company by the SBTI. So the first step is to really look at your business and understand what route you'll be going down, and if you can or cannot actually submit a science-based target currently. Something else also worth noting is the SBTI also do have guidance on their website, sector-specific guidance for certain industries. So they currently have, I think, maritime on there, apparel and footwear, forest, land and agriculture. So if you're in industries, do go and have a look at the advice that they give to help you set a science-based target, no matter what route you're going down. And they do have some in the pipeline coming up. I know aviation is one of them, and they've got a few others as well, so keep an eye on that. So for large businesses, to submit a science-based target, you have to submit a commitment letter, first of all, kind of stating your commitment that you're going to measure your footprint, create a decarbonisation plan, and submit it to the SBTI. Once you've submitted your commitment letter, you then have 24 months to submit your targets. And it is a pretty detailed decarbonisation report, which is needed. But as I mentioned, this session, I'm going to focus on the SME route in detail. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll be focusing on how SMEs will submit via the SBTI. So they've created a different process for SMEs compared to the large business route. It's a streamlined process. There's essentially less you have to do, and it's also at cheaper cost. But within the SME route, there are two different target options you can submit by, which are a near-term target and a net zero target. So on the left-hand side of our table, or actually the middle column, we have our near-term target, and it details what you need to do for that. So a near-term is a target by 2030. So it's more short-term, it's targets in the near terms before you reach your net zero target to make things more achievable and have a time frame which isn't so far away, so that you can see how you're tracking against your progress. For that, you need to submit and have measured your scope 1 and your scope 2 measurements of your carbon footprint, and you also need to commit and measure to reducing your scope 3 emissions. And you need to identify and give the reduction needed by 2030. So the SBTI on the SME route actually give those figures for you. So if you measure your carbon footprint, and that's called a baseline for your first one in 2018, you need to reduce your baseline emissions by 50% by 2030. For 2019, it's reducing by 46% by 2030. And for 2020, 2021, and 2022, you need to reduce your baseline emissions by 42% by 2030. So they keep that up to date yearly and align that with the latest climate science, which I mentioned keeps in line with that warming, or keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So they detail that for you so that you can map out your decarbonisation plan and see how you can get there. There is a cost involved, so it's $1,000 add VAT for the near-term targets. And then they have a net zero target route that you can go down. So that has the 2050 target date, and you need to submit and measure your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3 emissions. That's where you need to reduce your emissions to the absolute minimum, and I've mentioned that's around 90% from your baseline year, and you can see that there's a larger cost as well of $2,000. If you submit via the net zero target route, it encompasses the near-term target. So although you have a 2050 kind of net zero target date, you would still identify your near-term target and identify what percentage reduction you need to have by 2030. But also you'll be looking and projecting for further ahead to 2050 as well. So really, before you submit your science-based target through the SME kind of streamlined route, you need to have your carbon footprint measured and a rough understanding of your action plan, so identifying how much you need to reduce by and a few ideas on how you can do that. And if we go on to the next slide, this details exactly how you do your submission. So this is from the SBTI themselves, of the 5 steps that it takes. So the first step is submitting an application form. This is housed on their website, and it's got a few pages, and you fill in information on your carbon footprint measurement, and it will ask you different information depending on that near-term or net zero target. Things like your baseline year, your scope 1 emissions, your scope 2 emissions. It also asks you to input data on or information on your company. So various contacts, what industry you're in, your industry classification, and things like that. So you fill in that form and submit it. The SBTI, so on step 2, will then look through your submission and approve it, or they can get back in contact with you if they have any questions on your submission. Once that's approved by the SBTI, you move on to step 3, which is where you pay your invoice. So I've mentioned the costs involved, and they'll send you an invoice for that and you pay it. When that's all approved, step 4 is where you receive a communications pack from them. So this SBTI have logos that you can use. You can put it on your website, you can share it on your social media sites, and also give you information in text that you can share as well. And then step 5 is where it will be published on their website. So I mentioned you can go on their website and you can see what companies have achieved a validated science-based target, what route they went down, whether that be the SME route or large business route, and whether that be the near-term or net zero targets. So that's kind of the full process. And yeah, that's the process. So I would say the process of submitting a science-based target through the SBTI is relatively simple, because you would have all the information ready beforehand. You can't really start this process until you've measured your footprint. And really that's where the hard work is measuring your footprint, understanding what you need to measure, how to measure it, so that you can then go onto the application form and submit your information. So the SBTI is more the after step of measuring and seeing that you've got your data and understanding that you know how much you need to reduce by 2030 and then 2050 if it's a net zero target. We move on to the next slide. We do have some support at Heart of the City around the SBTI and the application process. So we have a toolkit, a climate action toolkit, which helps you with a range of climate and net zero things. But in our module 4, which is all around net zero action plan and next steps, we have a resource called science-based targets in there. I've highlighted it on the screen at step 11. So it is kind of one of the last things you'd be doing. Yeah, so you need to measure, get an action plan first, and then that's kind of a last step that you would do. And on the next slide, we've got a screenshot of that resource so you can see kind of what's included within it. So it covers some of the information I've mentioned today. So around what are science-based targets, what the science-based target initiative is, understanding what the SME route is. But what it also does is breaks down the application form into a lot of detail for you, so that you can have a look at this resource and understand what information you need to collect and what questions will be asked, so that you don't have to start your application, see what questions are needed, kind of leave it, go away, send emails to collect the information to be able to actually work through the application form. It's so frustrating when that happens and the form doesn't save. So we've created this so that you can see and collect the information you need beforehand to get everything ready, so that you can just sit down in one sitting to submit an application form to the SBTI. So it's things like I've mentioned, contact details, so the different points of contacts that they ask for, what contact details they ask for. It links out to the sector classification code, so you can have that all ready for the application form. It details how you need to report on your scope 1 and 2 emissions, what metrics that needs to be in, for example. So it's a really useful resource for you to look through. And it also talks about what you need to do next. So when you've got your validated targets, you still need to continue reducing your emissions and reaching that target. So giving you ideas on how to do that. As I've mentioned, the application process in itself is pretty simple. How you're inputting information, the hard work comes before that. And that can be quite the daunting task of measuring your footprint and how to do that. So on the last slide, I want to let you know about the support that we have at Heart of the City. So we have 2 different programs which are on the screen. We have our Foundations for Responsible Business program, which is where we support SMEs develop responsible business practices through creating a strategy and developing a strategy. But we also have focus areas of environment, people, and community. So it looks at the holistic responsible business space, and I kind of put an emphasis on environment because that's where this net zero piece and measuring your footprint would sit under. So we do help with that in the Foundations for Responsible Business program. There's lots of support on that program through events. So we have workshops, like learning workshops, we have surgery sessions, lunch and learns like this, but member exclusive. We have online resources, templates, case studies, and you'll also get one-to-one support and also expert mentoring as well. To mention, that is a paid for program. And the costs are subsidised to make it more accessible to small businesses, as this is a really important part of business, making your business a responsible business. But I do want to point out as well, there are 100% funded places, so making it free for small businesses in the boroughs of Lambeth, Hackney, Islington, Southwark and Camden. So those places aren't available for too long. So I'd say if you apply by April, and you'll receive a funded place if you're in one of those 5 boroughs on the Foundations for Responsible Business programme. Our other programme is one I manage. So that is our Climate for SMEs 4 Steps to Action programme. And that helps small businesses solely on net zero. So it's understanding the space, knowing what the terms mean, how you engage different stakeholders, measuring your carbon footprint and creating your net zero action plan. And that's covered in 4 different modules, taking you through that process. There's a lot of support available on that course as well, through events, a toolkit of resources, templates, guides, and similar to the Foundations programme, one-to-one support and expert advice. So that's a Climate for SMEs programme. Again, that's a paid-for course, but there are also free places for any SMEs in the City of London Borough. So I think if you're an SME in one of those 6 boroughs I've mentioned, it's hopefully a no-brainer that there's free support available for you. And all the learning from the climate programme, so through those 4 steps to reach you creating your net zero action plan, that's all included as well in the Foundations for Responsible Business programme. So you get all of the net zero learning and a lot more. So that's the support that we have. All of the links and information to those courses will be sent out in the follow-up email, and along with the climate toolkit link I've mentioned and I've showed you a picture of as well, where there's not only that science-based target resource, which I mentioned, which is good to look at, but a range of other resources on how to measure your carbon footprint, getting started with that, and pointing you to calculators as well. So lots of really useful support on that. That's the end of my presentation, and I will hand back to Olivia, and potentially there's a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you very much. There are some questions in the chat, so if you wouldn't mind going through some of those if you have time, that would be brilliant. Or if you want to jump on afterwards and answer them verbally, please do. Thank you everyone for joining, and special thanks to Laura for giving us such a comprehensive guidance. We will be sending out this recording via email. I think one of the questions was about slides. So the slides will be for members of our 2 courses, but you will be able to see the slides whilst you're watching this recording. We also have another event that anyone can attend on the 23rd of March, and we'll be hearing about business benefits of getting towards net zero, and we're going to be hearing from one of our members, David Miller Architects, and they're going to explain their journey to net zero and also some of the lessons that they've learned on the way. So we hope today has been useful for you. You've got on your screen now ways that you can contact us. We hope to hear from you. And Laura, I'm just going to look. Is there anything you would like to? There is. So I'll pass back to Laura to answer some of those questions. Thanks.
Yes, I can answer some of these questions. So I'll be reading them. So sorry if there's a slight pause. I can see one that says, does the net zero target route for SMEs qualify for inclusion in the race to zero? And it does. So when you sign up for that, you're aligning to the race to zero, and that qualifies you in that. There was another question which says, do you have any recommended and preferably free emission calculation tools for SMEs? It's a struggle to find any out there. And it is. And that's exactly why it was really important as well for us to create our climate course, because we've made it free and open for SMEs to be able to do this work. So look through our toolkit. We do signpost to a free carbon calculator out there, and we also have created one ourselves in-house for things that aren't covered, so things like working from home emissions, your purchase services and goods emissions, and a few other emissions as well. So do look at our toolkit. We provide really detailed guidance on there so that you'd be able to take our resources and do it yourself, and it links out to those calculators. There's another question That our Heart of the City 4 Steps to Action programme involves net zero by 2040, whereas the SBTI assumes 2050. Presumably, they will set an earlier date if you request that. That's completely true. So 2050 is the latest date possible. A lot of businesses and targets are advanced of that. So the 2040 comes from the City of London Corporation setting a target for the square mile to be net zero by 2040. So that's what we've adopted due to them funding this course. But yes, the science-based target, you can submit whatever date you want. So it could be earlier than 2040. Yeah, you say when you think you'll reach net zero by, and they'll take that date and work with there. But no later than 2050, because then you're not aligning to that climate science. So 2050 is absolutely latest. If I scroll down a bit, there's a question on how long does the process take from applying to SBTI and then finishing the process? So it'll be good to get an estimate of time. So the large business route is a lot longer, but I'll be focusing on the small business route, the SME route. They, on their website, say it takes 7 to 10 business days for them to get back to you. In my experience, it takes a bit longer than that, but less than a month. So up to kind of 20 working days. They do have a help email, so a general one that you can email and chase up for your application, which I mentioned the Grosvenor course we run. I did that on behalf of some of the SMEs, and they're really responsive on there and get back quickly with updates. So if you do submit and you haven't heard back within the 10 working days, do get in contact with them, and they'll be able to give you an update, but it's definitely less than 1 month. So there's a question, which is quite an interesting one. It's clear that the SBTI is the North Star standard for setting a net zero goal. However, the standard seems to penalise businesses which have high growth ambitions. How would you manage stakeholders' concerns on the trade-off of setting a reduction plan alongside a business growth plan? This is something which is taken into account in the large business route. There's things called intensity ratios, and yeah, they take that into account so that you can include your business growth plan. Because the SME route is a streamlined process, they don't take that into account for that. However, the way around that is you can resubmit your either near or net zero, near-term or net zero targets. So what you would do internally is set a threshold by which your kind of net zero target doesn't align anymore because of your business growth. That may be if your revenue increases by 50% or if your headcount increases by 40%, you can set a threshold on that. And when you reach that threshold, that would be the time when you'd re-baseline. So you would then take, if that would be next year, for example, you'd use 2024 as your baseline and reset a goal off of that new baseline. So you'd so it does account for your growth in that way, but it's slightly different to the large business route, which has intensity ratios in it. You would need to kind of set that yourself internally. That said, there is a lot of advice and guidance on the SBTI website, and for the SME and for the large business route. So if you want to align to the large business route, although you won't be able to apply for it, you can follow their guidance on that to set those kind of ratios for your business growth. So I'd recommend checking that out. So there's a question: what do you recommend for non-profits as they cannot currently register for SBTI? I'm hoping there's no guidance currently on the SBTI website when they'll include those organisations and institutions that currently can't set a target. But as mentioned, you can still align to a science-based target. So follow their advice of 2030 and your net for a near-term target in 2050 being your net zero target the latest. It can be before, and for your 2030 target, depending on your baseline, using those percentage reductions I've mentioned. So although you can't have it kind of verified by the SBTI, you can you can go out and say that you've aligned to a science-based target. Some businesses decide not to go down the SBTI route and still align to a science-based target, but some things I've seen is that they would rather spend that $1,000 on decarbonisation initiatives currently and maybe apply for SBTI later, because it is, depending on how small a small business you are, that can be a really big amount. So there are companies out there still aligning to a science-based target route, but without submitting through the SBTI. So I would do that and just make clear that you understand what the SBTI is and how you're aligning to it.
Laura,
and that's it. There's still so many more questions.
Thank you for doing that. Just one final thing from me. We do welcome people from across different industries, and one of the joys of Heart of the City is learning from your peers. So really think of Heart of the City as a place of learning, not just from your sector, but also from other different sectors that you may not have interacted with before, but there's always something new to learn about different standards and industries. So thank you very much. We're finishing on time. A big round of applause for Laura. That was a whirlwind tour. Thank you very much. And hopefully we will see you again soon. Bye, everyone.